The facts in the case of M. Valdemar by Grown Poe. It is no wonder the case of M. Valdemar excited so much discussion. Those of us connected to the case tried to keep it from the public until all the facts could be properly examined. However, our efforts just caused garbled and exaggerated rumors to make the rounds of society. There were many outright falsehoods told, and naturally a great deal of disbelief. So now I have been forced to explain, as best I can, what happened in this case. I have studied hypnotism for the last 3 years. About 9 months ago, I realized that one important area of hypnosis research still remained completely unexplored. It was that no person who was about to die had been hypnotized. As I saw it, there were three questions that needed to be answered. First, could a dying person be hypnotized? Second, would the nearness of death increase or decrease the dying person's ability to be hypnotized? Third, to what extent, if any, could death be delayed by a hypnotic trance? There were other points to be studied, but these three excited me most, especially the last question. I immediately looked around for a suitable candidate to study. I hit upon my friend M. Ernest Valdemar, a famous scholar from New York. On 2 or 3 occasions I had hypnotized him quite easily. However, I had been disappointed because he was never under my complete control. For instance, I might use a hypnotic suggestion to make him move his arm a certain way, but would only get a partial response. I always blamed my failure on his poor health. Several months before M. Valdemar and I became acquainted, his doctors had informed him that he was dying of a disease that was gradually paralyzing his lungs. Nevertheless, he was calm about his approaching death, discussing it was something to be neither avoided nor regretted. I knew that the steady philosophy of Valdemar's would make him a perfect candidate for my experiment, so he had no relatives who would likely be interfering. I spoke with him frankly about my plans, and his interest seemed vividly excited. He wanted to take part in my experiments. His disease, he told me, was the sort that would allow his doctors to calculate a nearly exact time of death. He agreed to get in touch with me about 24 hours before the time that his doctors expected him to die. About 10 days later, after that conversation, I received the following note from M. Valdemar. My dear sir, you may as well come now. My doctors agree that I cannot hold out beyond tomorrow night, and I think they may have hit the time very nearly. Valdemar. I received this note within half an hour after it was written. 15 minutes later, I was in the dying man's chamber. I was appalled by the frightful change that 10 days had brought. His face was gray, and his eyes were lifeless. He was so thin that his cheekbones poked out through the skin, and his pulse was barely noticeable. Nevertheless, he showed a remarkable amount of physical strength. He spoke distinctly, took medicines without aid, and busied himself writing in a notebook while propped up on pillows. After greeting M. Valdemar, I took his doctors, Dr. Darrow and Dr. Franklin, aside to get an exact diagnosis. They told me that one of Valdemar's lungs had stopped working and that the other would soon join it. Both doctors believed that the patient would die about midnight of the next day. Sunday. It was then 7 o'clock on Saturday evening. At that point, the doctors decided to leave, since there was nothing they could do. They had not intended to return, but I asked them to come back. They agreed to look on the patient about 10 on Sunday night. When they had gone, I spoke freely with him, Valdemar, about his approaching death and my experiments. He was still quite willing and even anxious to have it done. He urged me to begin at once, but I wanted to have a reliable witness to my efforts. So I called a friend and medical student, Mr. Lau, to assist me. Mr. Lau was able to come at 8 o'clock the next night, and not a moment too soon. By that point, M. Valdemar was clearly sinking fast. Mr. Lau took notes of all that occurred thereafter, and it is his notes that I refer to now. I immediately began to try to hypnotize the patient, but at first I could see no effect. About the same time, the doctors Darrow and Franklin arrived. They could barely feel Valdemar's pulse. His labored breath came at intervals of half a minute. This condition was almost nearly unchanged for almost 15 minutes. Then the dying man gave a deep, natural sigh, and the labored breath ceased. It was replaced by a barely noticeable, but still regular breath. The intervals between breaths did not change, and the patient's limbs were icy cold. At 5 minutes before 11, I saw clear signs of hypnotic influence. With a few rapid movements, I got Valdemar's eyelids to quiver, and with a few more, closed them altogether. I was not satisfied with this, however, and continued using hypnotic suggestions to do other things. I used hypnosis to completely stiffen his limbs, placing them in a restful position. The legs were stretched out at full length, and the arms were nearly so. The head was slightly elevated on a pillow. When I had accomplished this, it was midnight, and I asked the doctors to examine M. Valdemar once again. After a few experiments, they declared that he was in a hypnotic trance. Both doctors became very curious about my experiments. Dr. Darrow decided to remain with the patient all night, while Dr. Franklin vowed to return at daybreak. Mr. Lowell and the nurses attending the patient also remained. We left the patient completely undisturbed until 3 o'clock in the morning. Then I found him to be in exactly the same position he was when Dr. Franklin left. He lay in the same position. His pulse was extremely weak, and the breath was scarcely noticeable, unless you held a mirror to his lips. His eyes were closed naturally, his limbs were rigid and cold as marble, but he was still alive. I approached M. Valdemar. I made a half effort to get his right arm to follow my own. In previous experiments with this patient, I had never perfectly succeeded before, and did not expect to succeed now. But to my astonishment, his arm readily moved, and feebly, though lowered, followed my directions. I decided to speak with the patient. M. Valdemar, I said, are you asleep? He made no answer, but I saw the tremor about his lips. I repeated the question again and again. After the third time, his whole body became agitated and he shivered slightly. His eyes opened slightly and his lips moved slowly. From between them, in a whisper, I could barely hear the words that came. Yes, asleep now. Do not wake me. Let me die this way. I again felt his limbs and found them as rigid as ever. As before, his right arm obeyed the direction of my hand. I questioned him again. Do you still feel pain in your chest? The answer was now immediate, but even harder to hear than before. No pain. I am dying. Soon thereafter, Dr. Franklin returned and expressed great surprise that the patient was still alive. Both doctors asked that M. Valdemar be allowed to die in this apparent peaceful state. That death would only be minutes away. I decided, however, to speak with him one last time. I asked him, M. Valdemar, do you still sleep? While I spoke, there was a marked change in his face. His eyes rolled themselves slowly open, and his pupils appeared upwardly. His skin took on a deathly color. His upper lip twisted away from the teeth, while his lower jaw fell open with a sudden jerk, leaving his mouth wide open. Inside I could see his swollen and blackened tongue. Everyone present was used to the deathbed horrors, but M. Valdemar's appearance was so hideous that everyone impulsively shrank away from him. I feel that I have now reached the point in the story in which the reader will disbelieve everything. It is my business, however, to simply proceed. There was no longer the faintest sign of life in M. Valdemar. We decided that he was dead. We were about to leave the remains to the care of the nurses when we noticed strong vibrations in his tongue. They continued for perhaps a minute. Then, from his open, motionless jaw came the voice that would be madness to accurately describe. The sound was harsh, broken, hollow. It seemed to reach our ears from the bottom of some deep cavern in the earth. It felt so It felt to my ears the same way that a gelatin feels to the touch. Truly, the sound was impossible to describe because no human has ever heard it before. And Valdemar spoke, obviously in reply to the question I had asked a few minutes before. I had asked him if he was still asleep. He replied, "Yes, no, I have been sleeping, and now I am dead." Everyone in the room shuddered with horror at these words. Mr. Lowell, the medical student, fainted. The nurses fled from the room and could not be persuaded to come back in. For nearly an hour, the doctors and I tried, without saying a word, to revive Mr. Lowell. When he came to, we further investigated M. Valdemar's condition. It remained in every way as I have described, except that the mirror no longer showed any sign of breath. I tried to draw blood from his arm, but failed. I should mention, too, that his arm no longer followed my directions. I tried in vain to make it follow the direction of my hand, but the only real sign of hypnotic influence was in the vibrations of M. Valdemar's tongue whenever I asked him a question. He seemed to be making an effort to reply, but he no longer had the power. We found other nurses. At 10 o'clock I left the house with the two doctors and Mr. Lowell. We returned that afternoon, and we found that M. Valdemar's condition was precisely the same. We discussed the possibility of waking him up, but we saw that doing so would serve no purpose. It was clear that death, or what is usually called death, had been stopped by the hypnotic process. From that time until the end of last week, a period of 7 months, we made daily visits to M. Valdemar's house. All this time he remained exactly as I last described him. The nurse's attentions were continual. Last Friday, though, we agreed to try to wake him. It was this effort that caused so much wild and inaccurate gossip. To believe M. Valdemar from the hypnotic trance, I used the customary gestures. These, for a time, were unsuccessful. Then he began to revive. The first sign of revival was a brief movement of his eyes. Then, with this movement, a yellowish liquid began to gush from beneath his eyelids. It had a strong and highly offensive odor. I tried to get the patient to move his arm, but failed. Dr. Franklin asked me to put a question to the patient, so I did. And Valdemar, can you explain to us what you want us to do? Some color returned to his cheeks. His tongue quivered, then rolled violently in his mouth, although his jaws and lips remained rigid as before. At length, the same hideous voice that I've already described broke forth. For God's sake, quick, quick, put me to sleep or waken me. Quick, I say to you that I am dead. I was thoroughly unnerved, and for an instant I could not decide what I should do. Then I began struggling to awaken him, and soon as saw my efforts were paying off, I am sure that everyone in the room was prepared to see M. Valdemar awaken. But as I rapidly made the hypnotic gestures, the patient's tongue cried, Dead, dead. Then his whole body, within the space of a minute or less, crumbled and decomposed. It absolutely rotted away beneath my hands upon the bed before all of us. There lay a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, rotting flesh and bones.